Unit 4, a useful illusion, ? Section 1, what does the self do? Blackmore asks, quote, "So what does myself do? Surely it must at least be the center of my awareness, the thing that receives impressions as I go about my life." Not necessarily. The very natural idea that I hear the sounds, feel the sensations, or see the world may be false. Conscious sensory impressions can be induced by stimulating the brain, but only when it is continuously stimulated for about half a second. It is as though consciousness takes some time to build up. This would lead to the odd idea that our conscious appreciation of the world lags behind the events, because of a process Libet calls subjective antedating, we never realize it is lagging behind. The story we tell ourselves puts events in order. What does it mean to say that I believe? It sounds as though there must be a self in there who has things called beliefs. But from another perspective, there is only a person arguing, a brain processing information, memes being copied or not. We cannot actually find either the beliefs or the self who believes, end quote. Blackmore then refers again to Libet's work to the effect that, quote, "The readiness potential began about 550 milliseconds, just over half a second, before the action, and the decision to act about 200 milliseconds, about 1/5 of a second, before the action." In other words, the decision to act was not the starting point, a finding that can seem a little threatening to our sense of self. My brain does not need me. The implication is that consciousness does not direct the action. Conscious awareness comes all right, but not in time. The hand is removed from the flame before we consciously feel the pain. We have whacked the tennis ball back before we can be conscious of it coming towards us. We have avoided the puddle before we were conscious of its existence. Consciousness follows on later, yet we still feel that I consciously did these things, end quote. Blackmore also refers to the British psychologist Guy Claxton, who, quote, "suggests that what we take for self-control is just a more or less successful attempt at prediction. Much of the time, our predictions about what we will do next are reasonably accurate, and we can get away with saying, 'I did this,' or 'I intended to do that.' When they go wrong, we just bluff." Claxton concludes that consciousness is a mechanism for constructing dubious stories whose purpose is to defend a superfluous and inaccurate sense of self. Our error is to think of the self as separate, persistent, and autonomous. Like Dennett, Claxton thinks that the self is really only a story about a self. The inner self who does things is an illusion, end quote. Blackmore reinforces this by insisting, quote, there is no center of action where a self might reside. There is no one place into which all the inputs go and from which all the instructions get sent out. This is an important point and deeply disturbing. We feel as though we are a central observer and controller of what goes on, but there is no place for this central controller to live, end quote. And she adds that, quote, the description that neuroscientists are building up of the way the brain works leaves no room for a central self. There is no single line in to a central place, nor a single line out. The whole system is massively parallel. In this description, there is no need for a you, end quote. Blackmore also questions any obvious separation between observed and observer, and refers to Hume's description of the self as no more than a bundle of sensations, quote. Staring determinedly into your own experience does not reveal a solid world observed by a persisting self, but simply a stream of ever-changing experience with no obvious separation between observer and observed. The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume explained that whenever he entered most intimately into himself, he always stumbled upon some particular perception of heat or cold, or pain or pleasure. He could never catch himself without a perception, nor observe anything but the perception. He concluded that the self was no more than a bundle of sensations, end quote. Blackmore concludes that, quote, you might think that there is still room for a central self as some kind of informational or abstract center rather than an actual place. There are several theories of this kind, such as Barr's 97 global workspace theory. The workspace is like a theater with a bright spotlight on the stage. The events in the bright spot are the only ones in consciousness. But this is only a metaphor and can be a misleading one. If there is any sense to the idea of a spotlight, it is that at any time some information is being attended to or actively processed, while other information is not, end quote. But Blackmore insists that, quote, this focus of activity changes continuously with the complex demands of the task we are performing. If there is a spotlight, it is one that switches on and off all over the place and can shine in several places at once. If there is a global workspace, it is not located in any particular place. It cannot tell us where I am. The theater metaphor may do more harm than good to our thinking about self and consciousness. Dennett, 91, argues that although most theorists now reject Cartesian dualism, they still secretly believe in what he calls the Cartesian theatre. They still imagine that somewhere inside our heads is a place where it all comes together, where consciousness happens and we see our mental images projected on a mental screen, where we make our decisions and initiate actions, where we agonize about life, love, and meaning. The Cartesian theatre does not exist. When sensory information comes into the brain, it does not go to an inner screen where a little self is watching it. If it did, the little self would have to have little eyes and another inner screen, and so on. End quote.